Hey everybody, it's Jeremy for International Affairs. This is a new channel that we're starting, and I'm here with Matt.
Mm-hmm.
Matt and I are going to co-host this International Affairs channel, where it's our aim to talk about critical, important issues in international affairs, and kind of specifically narrow down and into national security intelligence issues that affect us. I've had several people recently, with all of the turmoil globally, ask me, based on our backgrounds, ask me, why should I care about these things, these foreign policy issues and things that are happening overseas? With all of the domestic political infighting, inflation, things are out of control, and people just want their lives, what they perceive as back to normal. And on top of all of that, we've got chaos in the world order. So, what's your take on international affairs, Matt? And I know you specifically have a lot of knowledge on Russia, Ukraine. That's kind of what we want to start this first episode about. Focus on that. It's a really important issue. So yeah, tell us a little bit about Russia, Ukraine, yourself, and I guess what you hope for our audience to learn from this channel.
Certainly. So yeah, I'm Matt Thomas. Jeremy and I were colleagues back getting our masters at Texas A&M's Bush School of Government and Public Service.
Ooh, yeah, right here in Aggie Land.
And so my background really goes. I guess I'll start with I am both a teacher and a foreign policy analyst. I teach history at a local private school here, and I write for Baltic Security Foundation and have written for a few others, such as Foreign Policy Research Institute. My primary focus is on Russia and Eastern Europe, particularly the Baltic Sea and Black Sea areas. So as far as what we're really aiming for with this channel is we want to show why international affairs really does matter for day-to-day life, and how it really impacts everything in the world around us.
Right.
And so with that aim in mind, what we're looking at for why does international affairs matter, and why do we care what's going on in the world is really, how does that impact each and every one of us as a whole? And it does, right? So I always tell my students, especially when we get to World War I and World War II,
right,
we are seeing really in America right now kind of this isolationist moment in our internal politics, and I tell my students, every time that you want to say, not my circus, not my monkeys, right? The monkeys find a way to make you part of their circus,
right? and we are.
Exactly. And so we look at things like the Zimmerman telegram or Pearl Harbor, and you see how no matter what we try to do to stay away and stay uninvolved, they find a way to involve us, right? So as a result, international affairs, not only does it affect everything from internal economic issues to every kind of what sort of situation that you're going to find yourself in, lest there be a war somewhere, right? Can run the gamut between those, but it can also affect everything related to unemployment and certain domestic policy issues, health crises, and other kinds of things. So international affairs is something that really is interconnected with domestic policy, and you really can't quite separate them as much as we would sometimes like to.
Right, especially the past 30, 40 years, everything's become so much interconnected, so much more interconnected, and we rely on foreign partners economically and for security alliances and other interests overseas and abroad. And so we're at a juncture now in time to where we are so interconnected that we see, just for example, with COVID-19 and the supply chain disruptions, logistics issues that we're still experiencing today here at home, because we no longer produce those things. We no longer make those goods. We may have lost some of that manufacturing knowledge. We don't have that skilled labor anymore. That's all been outsourced over a period of 30, 40 years at our own choosing to allow those things to go. But that's why, in some way, international affairs really matters, because it touches every aspect of our life. And so specifically today, Russia, Ukraine, we want to hit on that topic and have a discussion. So it's awesome that Matt is an expert in Russia, Ukraine issues and the Baltics, and that in future episodes we'll have on other guests, and we'll talk about other issues such as China, Iran, North Korea, and so on, because there's a lot. There's a lot.
You will never exhaust the topics that are available.
Right. And so Russia, Ukraine, where, in my mind, I'm kind of thinking, when I started getting really up to speed on international affairs in 2014 in regards to Russia, Ukraine, we have the breaking news coverage that you've got these little green men, you've got, the Ukrainian president, was it prime minister or president, one of the two.
Mm-hmm. President Poroshenko and
Yanukovych.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Kind of getting ousted in 2014, right. Exiled to Russia. There was a lot of politics between those two countries at play. But then we have the annexation of Crimea.
Mm-hmm.
And so do we need to, do we start at 2014, or do we need to go back to explain succinctly why Russia and Ukraine and what's happening today matters?
I mean, to a certain degree, you could go back all the way to 1932. You could go back to 1918. But I guess it wouldn't be a bad idea to kind of begin at 1991.
Okay.
Right? The Soviet Union is collapsing, and Gorbachev is trying to... sorry if my pronunciation of Russian words is a little foreign, right? So that is part of my background. I learned Russian while in school.
That's exciting.
So
I wish I knew Russian.
So if my pronunciation is a little strange, that's why. When Gorbachev was in power, right, he is trying desperately to save the Soviet Union, and he's going 1 minute into moves that are liberating people, and the next minute he's going into this kind of hardline reaction mode. And so there's this chaos and confusion, but ultimately he's not able to save the Soviet Union like he wanted to. In fact, he just accelerates its demise.
Right.
And out of that, Ukraine emerges as a free and independent country, right? So through that time, Ukraine has to figure out, okay, what path do we want to take? Do we want to follow a more Eastern Eurasian Russian model, or do we want to line ourselves up more with the West, right? And the country was pretty much split 50-50 for a good portion of that time between 1991 and 2014.
Okay, so I'll interrupt. So saying maybe about 50% felt they belonged more to Russia or the former Soviet Union than this new country, Ukraine.
Right. At least in terms of what the electorate, election results were showing and things like that, it would flip back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. Right. And some of this, of course, was organic, and some of it was efforts by the Russians to kind of try to keep what its existing neighbors in its own orbit.
Okay.
Right. So we can't generalize quite to the point that we would say that it's exactly 50-50 in terms of what society is, but that's what the election results were generally showing. And some of that, there's multitude of factors that go into all of that. But anyhow, typically what was happening was that the east and southeast of the country would kind of vote for pro-Russian parties, and the north and northwest would vote for kind of pro-Western parties. And it would flip back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, right?
Yeah.
So then enter onto the scene Viktor Yanukovych. And Yanukovych comes in what was largely kind of decried as a corrupt election that was sort of bought and sold, right? And he is firmly a pro-Russian candidate. He starts enacting primarily pro-Russian policies, and the endemic corruption that had come out of the Soviet era gets worse under Yanukovych.
Okay.
Right? And this actually is where you get a lot of the beginnings of some of the scandals that are still haunting us now.
Sure, right.
In our political scene is during the Yanukovych regime. So Yanukovych comes in and things are getting worse. And by and large, the Ukrainian people are starting to go more solidly on the side of seeking a pro-Western route. They're sick of the corruption. They're sick of the lack of direction for their country. They want to have a vision for what the future would hold. And most of them at this point have had access to the West, and they want that model instead.
Right. Okay.
Right. So this is building through the Yanukovych era. And by 2014, you have these mass protests called the Maidan, right? And the Maidan was really about free and fair elections, right? Getting rid of a lot of the endemic corruption and establishing a path towards a more Western democratic republic kind of system.
Okay.
Right, in Ukraine. So Yanukovych gets ousted. He decries it as a coup. But and then the Russians take that narrative and continue to try to delegitimize the.
So a coup perpetrated by the West, because
exactly,
right, you know, this uprising, right? They want Western values. They want access to the Western markets, the Western way, democracy, essentially freedom.
Right.
Okay.
So yeah, it's kind of another Berlin Wall moment with the Euromaidan in 2014, right? And Yanukovych and the Russians and their allies kind of denounced this as some kind of illegitimate hostile takeover of power, orchestrated by the CIA and other kinds of things, right? You get all sorts of conspiracy theories going along with it. Some of them may have some basis in truth,
right.
But the amount that we can really say on some of that, we don't know, right?
Right.
So we have, as we're moving through that time frame, Russia is getting more and more and more anxious about losing Ukraine in its orbit. So it wants to control everything that happens in its near abroad, right? And it already doesn't like that the Baltics, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, have firmly gone over into Western institutions, right? And they want to prevent Ukraine from being able to do the same thing. And so in order to kind of make sure that doesn't happen, they're trying to manipulate all the outcomes in Ukraine. They want to keep Ukraine corrupt. They want to keep Ukraine with no real sense of direction. They want to make sure that it remains mediocre, right? So they're getting involved, and you start to have the breakaway republic phenomenon in the Donbass, and then you have the annexation of Crimea as well, and you get the invasion into the Donbass region in eastern Ukraine, which was particularly difficult for the Ukrainians because this is a major industrial region where you have a lot of heavy industry that contributes quite a bit to their economy. So this was a big blow, right? Enter again onto the scene after Yanukovych. You have a series of elections, and out of that, Petro Poroshenko ends up becoming the new president of Ukraine, and he is a businessman by origin, right, and has some history in politics. He goes forward and he sets out to kind of clean up some of the corruption that was endemic in Ukrainian politics.
And this is post 2014.
Right.
Okay.
So for right now, I'm kind of sticking on the domestic issues within Ukraine itself. before we get into the actual invasions and all of that,
Okay.
just
All
putting
right.
it into context.
Sure.
So Poroshenko comes in and he wants to try to clean up some of the corruption as well, right? And to move Ukraine into a more Western direction, moving it towards potential NATO membership, moving it towards potential EU membership, things like that, which at this point in time, to also add some more context, France and Germany are vehemently opposed to both of those things,
Okay.
and that will be important later.
Okay.
So as Poroshenko is going forward, he's having a really, really hard time combating the issues that had been deep set through the Yanukovych regime and really all the way back to the Soviet era. And he's largely unsuccessful at weeding out the corruption. And he'll have numerous investigations, right, into different things, but a lot of this ends up getting stymied. It's unsuccessful at times. And one of the big ones, again, is one of these scandals that haunts us today, the Hunter Biden scandal.
Right.
So we can talk about that as well as we move forward
Sure.
in this and how it all relates,
Right.
so that we get that historical context and understand where it falls in the timeline and what actually happened.
Yeah.
So that's going on during, bridging the gap between Yanukovych and Poroshenko. And Poroshenko starts to try to investigate things, but he's getting squashed, right? Eventually, the Ukrainian people, in the next series of elections, right, they decide that they want someone new, a fresh face, right? And you have this actor, a comedian, who has played the role of the president on a popular sitcom, right? Volodymyr Zelensky. And he is going to come in onto the scene promoting an anti-corruption campaign, and he wants to end the conflict in the Donbass, right? And so he'll be wildly popular,
Right.
and emerge onto the scene as this kind of charismatic leader. At first, he starts out really pretty naive, and there is kind of a sad but funny irony in that his last name is derived from the word for green.
Okay.
So,
All right.
right, kind of like a greenhorn,
Yeah.
right? And so you have this guy who is green at politics, right? He's new to it, and he's making some mistakes here and there, but eventually he kind of, as he gets his feet wet, he's starting to become a more effective leader, a more effective figure in politics, and he wins a second mandate in the next line of elections to be the president again, right? And now we get to April of 2021. The Russians start moving troops and supplies and medical supplies, medical personnel, right? Various food supplies, all kinds of things that you would need to launch some kind of action against another country, right?
Right.
And so as they're doing this, the world is watching and going, what's going on here? Right? And the Russians are going to be able to pass it off as, oh, we're just doing mobilization exercises
Sure,
and so on and so forth. Right? But they do it remarkably quickly. And then when they pull away from the borders around Ukraine, they leave a lot of stuff behind.
Right.
Right? So at that point, I predicted that, yes, something is coming within the next couple years, right?
Right.
So we have, at this point, we have lots of troops and supplies that we have seen can be rapidly mobilized to the border, right? But everybody's just kind of downplaying this like, oh, it's just the Russians doing Russian things, right? They're trying to make sure that there's, we're burying our head in the sand in this particular moment. And Ukraine was no different. They were used to these kinds of activities from the Russians, and so they didn't really think that anything big was coming.
Status quo, typical provocation.
Exactly. But the issue that so many people missed was they left so much stuff stationed behind, right? And the way that they did it, it was set up to where they could more or less launch a blitzkrieg
Okay.
kind of action against Ukraine. Okay, so you get moving forward into the next year, everybody's thinking, nothing's going to happen, nothing's going to happen. But wait, is something going to happen? And then February comes in February of last year, and they launched that blitzkrieg, which ultimately failed in its primary objective. But now we're mired in this long-standing war of attrition here in Ukraine.
Okay, so if we can take a couple of things that you said, and it opens up a whole another can of international affairs theory and things, but people might want to know why was Russia fed up with Ukraine, or why did they feel they need to take some type of action against Ukraine? And so this kind of starts to open up the idea of, I guess, great power politics, and why does any country feel the need to take action against another country? But in this particular case, Russia, Ukraine, if you can explain generally why Russia needs to have anything to do with Ukraine.
Okay. So Russia, we kind of, at this juncture, you can go back into ancient Russian history. You can talk about the Mongol invasions and whatnot, and the problems of Russian geography, right? It's been an invasion-prone territory for quite some time. And historically speaking, it tends to be kind of paranoid about its neighbors and about ensuring its security, right? You can go all the way back to that.
So, I mean, ultimately, this is, how does Russia ensure their security?
Right.
And they feel they need to expand their influence in order to protect what they have.
Right. And so in all of this, you have this long-standing history of Russian imperialism going all the way into the Soviet era, even as they're in their propaganda denouncing imperialism, right? They're imperial by nature as well, right? So they're trying to make sure that they are constantly expanding and constantly increasing their power in order to ensure their security. Now, what the kind of hardcore realists like the Mearsheimers of the world, right, whom you've probably heard in some of the news articles lately, they're going to blame the West for what Russia is doing, because they will say that we've threatened Russia by expanding NATO and whatnot. What they get wrong in that is that the growth in NATO is based on a principle of self-determination, right? This was done by the choice of the countries involved, right? We didn't try to expand it ourselves. It wasn't some kind of campaign against Russia in order to do so, right? Nor were there any agreements like so many people claim that Gorbachev was promised that NATO wouldn't expand. That didn't happen, right?
Right.
So all of this is playing into it, but by and large, what we really need to look at here in this context is Putin himself, right?
Okay.
So Putin is an ex-KGB officer, right, from the Soviet era.
I heard a killer and a thug.
Oh yes,
yeah,
yes, and he is, that's his mindset, right? He is, not necessarily ideologically married to communism or anything of that nature, but he is married to the idea of the Soviet Union, and he considers the fall of the Soviet Union to be the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. Right. So this is who we're dealing with, right? And he is, at the end of the day, revisionist in his outlook towards great power politics. He wants to reverse the outcome of the Cold War and bring Russia back onto the forefront. And one of the ways in which he can do that is by amassing more territory, amassing greater control, right? And essentially what he wants to do is push Western powers out. He wants to intimidate Western powers into staying out of world affairs in order that he can kind of maintain that power and control.
Right. Yeah. So this kind of brings up also, the idea of a zero-sum game, right? Mm-hmm. Any traction or step that the West makes, right, is a loss. He sees it as a loss to Russia.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And any step that Russia makes is a loss and a detriment to the United States and the West and our allies. And so a lot of international affairs theories can explain why what's happening is happening. Now let's go back. So Russia feels threatened from the West, expansion of the West and military alliance, NATO, security alliance.
At least so they say.
So they say, right. Mm-hmm. Putin is nostalgic for the Soviet Union and is doing what he can to gain that back.
Right, and rehabilitate it in the public image, right? He's, especially surrounding the World War II era, he has tried to rehabilitate the image of Joseph Stalin, eliminate the history of the gulags, things like that. And Russians are, as a result of a lot of the effective propaganda that he's used, they're very obsessed with World War II. And the average Russian believes more or less that Western countries did nothing in World War II and that they defeated Nazi Germany on their own. Right?
Yeah,
so you have this kind of false reality that is at play as well in the mindset of Putin. He's essentially living in a world of make believe, and he wants to make that into the reality.
Sure.
Right. And for him, right, he largely feels threatened by the West because he projects his own intents and his own aims onto the West. Right. So it's a failure of understanding in that particular context. There's the issue of threat perception comes up. And so you have more or less, somebody who is very threatening that claims to feel threatened.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So we have then Russia feeling threatened, this idea of a zero-sum game. If they're not gaining, somebody else is going to gain, or vice versa. So, and with them sharing a border with Ukraine, we see that could make sense. Right. But now the question comes up, why do we not just let Russia have Ukraine and keep from happening what is happening, which is everybody getting drug into something that we don't want to have to deal with, and people here at home don't understand.
Okay. So looking at why Ukraine actually matters to us at home, right? A lot of what we see in current American politics is either a tendency towards wanting to leave international affairs completely, right? We've had issues related to prolonged conflicts in the Middle East, and people are really weary of international issues, right? On top of that, you can also have kind of the complacent attitude as well, which says we're doing all the best that we can, and we congratulations to us, right? These kinds of things. And so you have these two kind of mentalities going on domestically as well that are really kind of unhelpful, right? When looking at this issue. So what do we do about it, right? Why are those mentalities unhelpful, and what should we do instead, right? That kind of becomes the question.
Right.
And at the end of the day, right, you have this basic kind of principle of, you can go back to any of the realism, you can go back to liberal idealism, you can go back to constructivism, all these different vocabulary terms that you can throw around and
Right.
theories. But at the end of the day, what we really seek in America, and from kind of that values-based perspective, right, where you can kind of blend a lot of the ideas,
Right.
is that we want to see a world that is safe for people to exercise self-determination and freedom, right? Going beyond the values based into more hard asset realism
Right.
kind of things. There's certain commodities, there's certain economic issues, there's certain even going down to war strategy issues that, for safety and security, both conventional military issues, economic issues, right? Those kinds of things, there's certain assets that different countries have that matter to us in American interests, right?
Yeah, I kind of
Mhm.
so I kind of see it as sovereignty, the idea
Yeah.
that
Mhm.
we are sovereign and are able to make our own decisions and determinations. And the only way we maintain that ability to make our own decisions and keep our homeland and people safe and maintain sovereignty is through security,
Mhm.
right? And so the only way to maintain security is to have influence amongst these other players. You've got a
Mhm.
chessboard of state actors that are free to do whatever they choose and suffer the consequences of whatever global coalition or the international community throws their way, which keeps a lot of things in check and in line.
Mhm.
And the fact is, at the end of the day, the strongest is going to have the most power, influence, and win. And us here in the West believe that our way of life and our way of government is best. And we should offer or allow everybody to experience the freedoms that we have and the value we place on humanity and life, dignity, respect. So,
Right.
The-
And you kind of have the question of, well, if not us, then who? And
right. So that's, if not us, then who? And is
then
the
the
who
answer-
somebody we want?
exactly. Is it us, or is it going to be Russia or China
Right.
or Iran, right? Somebody that is going to export by force
Right.
their values. And we see this in the lead up to World War II, for example, right? You have Britain pursuing the policy of appeasement, right? As Chamberlain tries to, just let Hitler take the Sudetenland and have the Anschluss with Austria and so forth. And they thought that at some point Hitler would be satisfied, right? But
No.
that's not going to be the case with somebody like that. And so you have the issue of protecting humanity and the rule of law around the world, right? Lots of people say, we don't want to be the world's policeman. We hear that all the time. But again, the question is, if not us, then who?
Right.
Right. And
so a move in the Russia-Ukraine issue, for the everyday person to understand, right? The moves that Russia is making is in an attempt to diminish American influence, which threatens our security, threatens our way of life, and potentially, ultimately, sovereignty of our country and any other state in the way of Russia's aggression.
Exactly. And so when you are faced with this kind of aggression where one state is allowed to violate the sovereignty
Unchecked.
of another state unchecked, right? They're not going to stop. They're going to keep violating the sovereignty of other states, just as Hitler with Austria and Czechoslovakia and than Poland, right?
Right.
In 1938, 1939, right? So you have that same principle at play here, right? And on top of that, you also have the issue of deterrence, right? And this is where we really failed in 2022, is that we were no longer setting up any kind of effective deterrence, right? We did not signal that we had either the will or the means. You know, we had the means, but we didn't have the will, right? To combat a Russian invasion of Ukraine, or re-invasion, because they already invaded it, right? You know, so we had shown that we didn't have the will to do that, and we did that by doing things like removing sanctions on the Russo-German pipeline project, Nord Stream 2. We did that by pulling troops out of Poland and restationing them back in Germany, and continuously siding with Germany when that state is the one that gave us the concept of Schröderization, right? Which basically is named for a former German chancellor who's now the head of a major Gazprom Russian project, right? So to give that context there, right? So that idea is something called state capture, where you corrupt a country's political elite in order to more or less pull the strings like a puppeteer, right? Yeah. In that country, at least within one major sector of the economy. So we're starting to side with a country that is recalcitrant and does not support many of the major goals of the organization NATO that it's a part of, right? And so we are signaling, at this point, we're signaling a radical shift away from focusing on what we had promised to Eastern Europe and in their peace and security, right? Protecting their sovereignty. So we let our deterrence down, and Afghanistan played a role in that as well. It showed that we didn't have the will to be involved in international affairs, that we were no longer had the stomach for it. And that was a big signal to Vladimir Putin that, okay, we're not going to do what needs to be done about this. So this, you can really chalk what happens in 2022 up to a failure of deterrence, right? Okay. We didn't show that we were going to take this seriously, right? And so that is a big part of the issue here, right? We're signaling military weakness and a lack of willingness to be involved. On top of that, Ukraine is a vital player in the world economy, particularly with food production.
Right.
So it is the breadbasket of Europe. It's also one of the breadbaskets of the world, right? And the grain harvest is vitally important to the world economy. So dealing with the possibility of a destroyed Ukrainian grain harvest means hunger in places like Africa and places in Asia, right?
Which is greater instability, more fires, greater problems.
Exactly. When you have economic conditions, especially dealing with hunger and poverty, right? You create the conditions for more instability politically, more bad governments to come onto the scene, right? That will be criminal in their nature towards their own people and towards the rest of the world. Yeah. Right. So you have that issue at play. You also have energy policy in the rest of Europe. As a result of the Soviet era, lots of gas pipelines go through Ukraine into Europe.
Right.
And this has fueled Europe's dependence on Russian energy supplies. But this threatens to reduce stability in Europe as a whole. So you've got all kinds of different moving parts to this thing that create lots of sticky situations geopolitically. And then you also have the human element, right? You have this massive loss of life, right? That didn't need to happen.
Right.
And you have the Russians bombing maternity wards, shooting at the largest nuclear power plant in Europe, right?
Right.
You have various crimes against humanity going on, right? And yes, in war that happens on both sides. But what we're seeing is that when the Ukrainians do it, they punish those responsible.
Right.
When the Russians do it, they encourage more.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
So what model do we want to promote in the world, right? And do we want a system where might makes right, or do we want a system where we have set rules and somebody to enforce them, right?
Right. So
from there, it again draws back to the question of our own security, right? If we don't want these things to happen to us, right, we have to make sure that it's not okay for it to happen. So you have to signal that military strength and that willingness to be involved in order to prevent a Russia or a China or an Iran from being able to run amok, right?
Yeah.
These are rogue regimes.
Right.
And that's just the reality of it.
Right. Yeah, very much so. And so that really does kind of answer why it's very complex, but but it can be broken down into something simple, right?
Mm-hmm.
Why does the US or the West care about what's happening in Russia and Ukraine? A lot of great historical context. There's plethora more of historical context that could be provided.
Mm-hmm.
But it really comes down to sovereignty, security, and how each state individually is going to maintain their security, and by doing so ensures their sovereignty.
Exactly.
So,
and protects human life in the process.
And protects human life in the process. And so that's really why Russia-Ukraine matters to the United States. But then there's also a school of people that will say maybe the world order needs to change, right? Maybe Russia's not as bad as they're portrayed to be. Yes, in war people die, but governments all across the globe are taking economic advantage of the things that they need, are loaning money to countries that may not be able to pay back those loans in order for them to hold hostage these countries into particular agreements. So a lot of people could argue, Russia's not doing anything that the United States wouldn't do if the United States felt ultimately threatened, which is complex and difficult.
So what that one comes down to really is the issue of state behavior and intent, right?
Uh-huh.
The worldview of the United States versus the worldview of Russia is an entirely different one. And even when we have presidents of different political parties and of different worldviews from each other, right? The basic worldview of the United States is not one that seeks after imperialism.
Right.
And whereas the Russian worldview seeks to basically extend its power at any cost, right? And it doesn't value that human life, right?
Right.
It doesn't value the sovereignty of other nations, only its own, right? And so you have more or less apples and oranges whenever you're looking at something like, we've heard before the objection that, well, the United States would do that in Mexico. Well,
Right.
no,
Right.
right? It wouldn't, right? For that reason, right? It's an entirely different worldview, right? So the Russian kind of view on that is more or less that we have the right to interfere in everything in our other countries near us, and they don't have the right to self-determination. The United States view is, okay, yes, we have the right to interfere from time to time whenever things are clearly going wrong.
Right.
But these countries have the right to self-determination, and they have the basically the principle of sovereignty again comes in this, and so the United States is really looking at a respect to sovereignty, whereas Russia is not, right? And China is not, right?
Yeah, that's excellent. And so I think that at least answers that basic question: why Russia and Ukraine and the conflict matter to the United States and everybody here at home. And so it's kind of the question that I had today. And I'm glad you were able to answer it. Do you have anything else you want to add regarding Russia, Ukraine, and why it matters?
Sure. So looking at our domestic political affairs, right? Russia, Ukraine is going to be a continued hot button issue in our politics. And Russia is also going to pay attention to that. So ever since the Soviet period, Russia has sought a policy whereby it seeks to, undermine the political situation of countries that it perceives to be its adversaries, or that it wants to, in the Soviet context, it wanted to spread communism around the world, right? In the modern context, it seeks to essentially destabilize any country that it considers itself to be at war with, right? So as we've been kind of snoozing since the end of the Cold War and trying to figure out what we're actually doing,
unfortunately,
right? From that time period, even going back to Yeltsin, and in 1994, you have the same concept of destabilizing other countries in Russia's near abroad, right? With the Transnistria issue in Moldova, and that's another sticky one to talk about at another time as well. But you have this background of Russia seeking to destabilize countries in order to promote its own stability and power.
Any instability they create just increases their stability and or prowess and power.
Exactly. And so on top of that, whenever Russia has considered itself at war with the United States, that never ended.
Right.
And so we are more or less in this ongoing, what they call hybrid war, right? Which basically is just everything short of conventional war, right? Yeah. It's your cyber attacks, it's your sabotage, it's your psychological operations, it's your interfering with elections. It's all of these kinds of issues fall under hybrid warfare. It can even be things like cutting undersea cables for communications, right? Everything falls under that umbrella, and it's able to fluctuate the intensity of that conflict throughout that time as it sees fit, right? So Russia has been in a Cold War with us. Again, really, it's never stopped, right? And so that is also at play. And what Russia wants to do in American society and in American politics is create an even bigger divide than we're already seeing, right?
Sure.
And to a certain degree, this is the actions of the Soviet Union that, even though it itself is in the grave, it's trying
old tricks.
The old tricks are pulling us down with it, right? So from that time period, during the Soviet era, they sought to really push the political left further left, right? And so they really focused on that avenue of political influence and political interference, right? And they did it through organizations like the Comintern and through military intelligence. On a post-Soviet era, right? They say, okay, we've already pushed the left way over here. Now we got to work on the right.
Right.
And so what in my analysis we're seeing is that really you're getting a split in the right between kind of the old conservative Cold War era kind of leadership versus a newer, more isolationist, unwilling to be involved in foreign affairs type of rift, right? And so you're seeing that split to where you have one party that's way over here and then one party that can't agree with itself, right?
Yeah.
And so if it can create more and more of that political instability, political chaos, then our own system is more and more dysfunctional.
Right. Yeah.
And so that's another angle for why it matters.
Right. Yeah. So I was actually reviewing the National Security Strategy. I think it was published in October of 2022 out of the White House, and then also the Intelligence Community's Threat Assessment that was recently released. And they both talk about the malign influence of Russia and interference in elections, right? Any instability they create, they're going to attempt to take advantage of the instability and the chaos that they create, right? It gives them a door in or multiple angles to work off of when...
and the ultimate objective is to weaken our ability to act.
Right. And that may have contributed to some of what's happening already, may have not. But they are definitely at play and attempting to destabilize not only the United States, but other countries.
Right. And these tactics are nothing new, right? It's what the Soviets were doing to us, and they're doing this now. Right. And another thing to bear in mind is that Russia, no matter how much it tries to purport itself in order, again, looking at ways that it can try to split the right? It likes to try to present itself as this protector of traditional values and things like that. This is baloney, right?
Yeah.
Russia has been one of the world leaders in abortion and other things for generations, right? And so you can throw that out the window, but also Russia supports anybody that is against us, right? It supports Iran, it supports China, it supports Venezuela, it supports Cuba, Nicaragua, right? On and on and on and on, right? And likewise, it supports countries that are state sponsors of terrorism, like Iran, right? Yeah. So you have, no matter what Russia tries to portray itself as, right, you don't want to fall for that.
Right. Or allow them to operate unhindered.
Exactly. Right. They are, they are a rogue regime. You have to remember that. True. And they support other rogue regimes in order to destabilize the United States and the Western world itself, right? In order to undermine our stability and our freedom.
Right. And, we're going to talk specifically about China another day, but as Russia attempts to destabilize the West and are becoming more and more aggressive in their foreign policy and how they operate, and with us having some tensions and issues with China. Now we have the prospect, very real prospect, of a far greater, stronger alliance economically, militarily, between China and Russia. And so it is critical that we don't allow Russia to gain additional strength or positioning that makes them appear like a greater partner for China, or like somebody that could benefit China's own ambitions of global domination.
Exactly. Right? And you kind of have with Russia and China. Now, to a certain degree, Russia-China alliances usually find a way to fall apart because one side, rooks the other, right? But they frequently get back together, and the reason is because they have a mutual enemy in us, right? And so they are. It's something to take very seriously that Russia and China axis could very well become a key, alliance in the future, right? That it could be something very powerful in world affairs, and it's already very powerful in the third world, in places where you have major debt diplomacy and from the Chinese end, and then you have the Russians propping up various dictators' militaries, right? And so you have that problem going forward. Is that the world that we want to see, right? Or do we want to deter that from happening?
Right. Yeah. And my vote is deter it from happening.
Exactly.
And so Russia, critical. What Russia's doing around the globe is critical. And I think it's important that everyday American citizens really understand, try to kind of tamp down or turn off for a moment the domestic political infighting and being, covered in this molasses of political turmoil and unrest that's plagued our country as of recent.
And is really a tool of the other side, right? And they can take aspects of it and distract from what actually happened,
right? Yeah.
In order to achieve their objectives, right?
Yeah.
But again, the Hunter Biden scandal is a big one, right? That happens under a pro-Russian president, and he's employed by a pro-Russian oligarch, and yet the Russians are able to sell this as the Biden family being bought and sold by Ukraine, and then you have other political issues that go with it. So we can see how the stories get twisted.
Right. Well, so, let's go into that for a second then.
Mm-hmm.
So Hunter Biden, and at least my opinion, I want to try to not be political here and stick to the facts, but the facts are with the Hunter Biden situation, being hired as consultant and or to sit on boards of these companies brings into question our own issue of corruption here at home, or allowing Russia to corrupt us.
Mm-hmm. And the reason I bring it up, again, looking at it from an apolitical perspective, is to see how Russia is able to use that particular event against us, right? And in our political environment is able to weaponize that to create more infighting and more instability, more inability to act coherently, cohesively, and again, eliminate our will to do what we would otherwise do to protect the sovereignty of another nation, right? So getting kind of back into the history of what actually happened, right? He's hired as a consultant in a major energy company right there in Ukraine. Right at the time, you're in the middle of the Yanukovych regime. Yanukovych is firmly pro-Russian, right? He's doing nothing to combat corruption. He's actually increasing the corruption, right? And you have various people in his inner circle who are oligarchs that are more or less in charge of major profitable industries and things like that. And this particular energy company is under a pro-Russian oligarch at the time. Right? And so Hunter Biden is employed by them. There's all kinds of shady deals going on. It gets flagged by the Latvian anti-money laundering agency of all places, right? And after the Maidan, Poroshenko, as the new president of Ukraine, is investigating what's going on. The United States, we're still in the Obama-Biden administration at this point in time, and we actually more or less told the Ukrainians to stop investigating this, or we will not help you with anything. So we blackmail them into stopping the investigation into what Hunter Biden's activities were with that particular organization, right? And essentially, we hear nothing more about it until the last couple of years, right? On top of that, then Vice President Biden was actually in charge of most of the Obama administration's foreign policy because they trusted him as the one who had the most experience in that area at that time. And he is the one who makes the decision in 2014 not to send lethal aid to Ukraine as they're being attacked by Russia in the Donbass, right? And then the Obama administration carries forward. They approve that policy and they move forward from there. So you can see that all of this is not exactly what most people have heard at this point. We have a very short memory on these things, right? So those are the facts on hand, right? Putting aside the political issues, you can see how different the story is now compared to what the reality was,
right?
And how that's being used to help divide and affect our ability to make effective decision making.
Yeah. So do you think this is something the Russians intentionally game planned and sought out? Right. Imagine an operation where a covert action, right, where let's target this individual, being Hunter Biden. Let's offer this great deal with the pure intent of hoping it trickles down into Americans becoming aware, right, that there is some type of political corruption, right, that would further divide. So
I think to a certain degree,
or is this just Hunter Biden, or is it just easy money and they want the easy money?
I think for to a large degree, it was on that side. It was the easy money initially, and it was part of the corruption that was keeping Ukraine mediocre at that point in time. So it was related to Russia's Ukraine policy more, and now it's an opportunity to affect current American policy as we see that is the family that's in the White House, right?
Yeah,
and so you have between that and then greenlighting Nord Stream 2 and other issues, the Russians must be very happy with a lot of the decisions that we've been making lately. On top of that, to again go into kind of my analysis on this, we're really not giving Ukraine any more than what it would take to lose more slowly, right? So we're not giving them what they need to win, which is just prolonging the issue.
Why are we not doing that?
A lot
of your analysis.
From that perspective, I think a lot of it has to do with fear of escalation. And when you're too afraid of escalation, just like Chamberlain, right? You get more escalation because you encourage that, right? You show that you're not going to stand up to the bully, and so you keep getting bullied, right? And this is really kind of what's at play here, is that we signaled that we're not taking this seriously, and we're not we're too afraid to make Russia mad, and so Russia basically gets to do what it wants until we decide that we're willing to make Russia mad again.
Right. But we are pushing the issue deeper and deeper into a no return point.
Exactly.
A zero return option. And so I don't understand. I don't understand. Other than being afraid to fully commit, I do understand that. Because our decision makers have to answer for it, right?
Exactly. And I don't envy them, right?
I don't either.
They have, what is the balance that for what you're willing to, how much money are you going to spend on this? And, how much does that affect what we keep for our own security, right? Yes, this plays a role in both, but you've got to find a balance there somewhere. And I'm glad that I don't have to make that decision.
Right.
But at the end of the day, what we have effectively signaled is that we're not going to deter, right? And so we're going to do what it takes to keep people happy here and keep ourselves getting elected, right? And then from there, we're not really focused on what the actual mission is, what is the actual objective, right? Either that or our objective is something entirely different from victory, right?
Right.
You know, so we have where we're basically locking ourselves into a quagmire.
Right. And then I guess, 20 years from now, whenever this issue's studied in classrooms at grad schools that teach international affairs, et cetera, there are answers. There are no easy answers on what we could do now. But how do you square with the American people that we are in the position that we're in, essentially, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because there's a large part of the electorate that I think understands here at home that things are not great with all of the problems that we face, Russia being this specific one. And people have heard about Russia for decades and decades and decades as a threat, a threat. Cold War's over. Cold War's really not over. And now Russia's becoming more aggressive.
I think where it really hits home is we look at, okay, our own national security and protecting freedom and sovereignty here, right? And how that affects the rest of the world, right? And how the rest of the world affects us, conversely, right? Also, the other issue is, okay, bringing it home. What happens when this thing explodes into something that's not just a regional conflict, right? And what is going to happen then? Did we really actually prevent a war? And were we really, going to save more lives by not getting involved? Or is it better to deter and prevent the war from happening in the first place, preventing even the regional conflict from happening in the first place? And so if we can, signal to people that, there are ways to, nobody likes war, right? Even the so-called war hawks, right? Nobody actually likes war. War is something that is, devastating, and it affects lives of everyday people, right? At every turn. So if we don't want a situation where we end up stuck sending our sons and brothers and husbands and now daughters and wives and so forth to die in some future conflict, well, how do you prevent that conflict from starting in the first place? Right? And that's more or less the answer. Is it goes back to, we have to show that we have both the capacity and the will, right? Now, that's not to say that we don't sometimes spend too much money on things in our military industrial complex and things like that. There are areas that are a boondoggle, but if we take a look at that particular issue, you want to project strength. You want to project that you are capable, that you are innovative, and that you are serious about protecting peace, right? It's basically peace through strength, right? Is the idea. And throughout the Cold War, the American people bought into that, right? And so where we have these issues now is that we are kind of trending back into the idea that if we just stay off in our own little corner, they won't bother us. But
they're going to go away.
Exactly. Yeah. We've found time and time again that that's not how it works, right? Especially not when you're already established as a world power, right? Because you are enemy number one to those who want to be in your spot, right? And do you want them there? Right. That's the question.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Okay. So I think that kind of about wraps it up. It's easy to understand state sovereignty, threats to your security, which could erode your sovereignty, and why states do what they do. That's playing out in Russia, Ukraine. That same theme is going to be playing out in all of the other hotspots around the world that we're going to discuss in future episodes. And again, I guess our intent to try to keep it understandable for most people. And I think we did a great job here today doing that. So that wraps it up for International Affairs, our first inaugural episode, I guess.
Yes, in plain language and unpolished.
Right, yeah, plain language, unpolished. These videos aren't going to be highly produced or edited to some extent, and we hope to probably do a video maybe once a week and bring in guests and
show you what we think and what they think, and hopefully enrich your understanding of the topic.
Absolutely. So, Matt, you did a brilliant job explaining some of the context. I appreciate that. Honored to have you as a co-host here on this show. Follow us on YouTube, hashtag INTA Now, International Affairs, and keep track of what we're doing. And we'll see you guys later on.
Right. Thank you.
All right.